Capablanca made strong players look helpless with seemingly simple moves, and this game will uncover 5 positional rules behind that quiet dominance. Capablanca is playing white here against Treybal, and now we have fairly normal opening moves. And let's start right here. What do we do in such cases? We think which piece to develop and how. But Capablanca knew one thing. Most games are won not by brilliant combinations, but because of an oversight. And therefore, your main job is to prevent those obvious mistakes, prevent blunders. And you do that by, first of all, asking yourself, what does he want? Right? In this position, for example, is there anything aggressive that your opponent can possibly play here on the next move? Well, there's pawn takes c4, he can possibly grab this pawn. Alright, is there anything else? There's also queen to b4, another aggressive move. And if black plays it, it's gonna put your king in danger if we envision this move to be played. He's gonna check the king, attack this pawn, attack the other pawn on b2. And now, knowing these two things, Capablanca played the next move, knight to d2, which covers this diagonal and guards this pawn on c4, keeping his position absolutely safe. While this may not seem like a big deal, Capablanca had the lowest blunder rate among other champions, so it does work. Now, black played f5, and now we continue the development, bishop d3, knight h6. Not entirely sure why black moved the knight here. I guess it is to defend this pawn just in case of a trade, and this pawn needs to move away. Anyway, white castled, black did the same. What do you do then? Once you develop your minor pieces, it is time to develop your heavy pieces, meaning your heavyweights, your queen and rooks. And Capablanca does just that, bringing the queen to c2, black goes g6, I guess to blockade this diagonal, and now rook to b1. Now Capablanca starts bringing rooks into play, and from here the rook will possibly support this expansion on the queen side. Black moved the knight to f6, potentially aiming for this central square e4, but now Capablanca does the same, knight e5. Knights in general love outposts, those advanced positions protected by the pawn. From here, the knight can keep standing there and put long-term pressure all around. Black does not like that, and he offers an exchange. Should you take here or not? Well, if you've been following this channel, you know that to take is a mistake. But in this case, I also really love the fact that Capablanca played f4, trying to keep the control, keeping this really strong grip on the position. And that brings us to the second rule. If you control the center, you limit your opponent. Now think about it. It's not just about this knight on e5. But because of this central dominance, because we dominate in the center, it makes it so hard for black pieces to move around. Like this queen can't really get out, this bishop can't get out, this knight cannot do all that much, this rook does not have many squares to go to, and you see all that is just as a result of white having this really strong presence in the center. Now black develops a bishop, and this is what we call a bad bishop. The bishop will need to have some psychotherapy, right? Complaining that I did nothing wrong and they say I'm bad. Yeah, but that's life, right? With this pawn structure, the bishop is clearly going nowhere. Now white goes knight to f3, cementing this knight in the middle of the board, and after that he goes b4, starting to expand on the queen side, looking for targets to attack. Black retreated the bishop to e8, trying to make a more harmonious setup with his pieces, and how would he play here as white? Since white have played pawn b4 on the previous move, it might make sense to push forward, and that's what most of us would do one way or the other. But here's the difference. When you play a move like that, there is some risk here that when your opponent tries to fight back, he will have some counterplay. And certainly, it's not the end of the world. White's position is still very good. But nevertheless, this counterplay from your opponent increases chances for you to overlook something. And this is exactly what Capablanca wanted to avoid. His approach was different. He thought blunders happen when you attack before you are ready, and instead he played rook to c1. Capablanca's idea was to improve your position as much as you can before you start doing something risky or committing. And you see that he's really trying his very best to put every piece that he's got to the position of maximum power. Black played a6, trying to control that square, and again he goes queen f2. The move that does not even seem to make that much sense, but nevertheless very slightly improves the harmony of his pieces. Now this rook is open, not cluttered by his own queen. Maybe the queen wants to enter on the king side, putting some pressure down this file. We don't know, but anyway, he's trying to make every little effort he can to put his every piece to its best position. Now black traded off this knight on e5 and then offered one more exchange. Would you trade knights here or not? Capablanca refused to trade and played knight to f3, but why? Because pony saved is pony earned. No, because when you have space advantage, it's good to avoid exchanges. Now all these pieces are standing in the way of each other, unable to move and blaming each other for inefficiency. Now black plays rook c8, potentially hoping for the c-file to be opened if white ever trades on d5, which white didn't. Then black would recapture and black would have some activity along the c-file for his rook, but that's the exact moment when Capablanca shuts it all down with pawn to c5, bringing us to the next important idea: space is power. It limits your opponent. Just like previously, we talked about the fact that if you have that strong grip in the middle of the board, in the center, that restricts all your opponent's pieces, but having a space advantage is even better. Now these pieces can get out, the other rook can get out, this knight can't really move efficiently anywhere, and of course the bishop is still totally dull. He restricts his opponent's pieces long before they could cause any danger. Now black goes knight f6, potentially activating the knight. White goes a4, still preparing that expansion on the queen side with pawn to b5 at some point. Knight g4 hits the queen, and Capablanca plays queen e1. At first this may look strange, but not only he got the queen out of danger, he's also keeping an eye on this pawn so that the knight cannot capture it, and maybe potentially is even keeping an eye on this square, so that if he ever moves the knight away, black can't move forward and create threats on the king side. You see how careful he was with his moves? There's rumors that Magnus Carlsen was initially Magnus Blunderson, but then studied games of Capablanca and leveled up. Now black realized this knight isn't really doing anything and decided to reroute it back to defense. White goes h3, and then after knight f7, there's another very interesting moment. Now it feels like, okay, white is now fully ready, and finally it's time to play b5 and start invading there and making threats. But Capablanca refused to do that. Why? Because if he played b5, that would allow black to trade, open up a file for his rook, and get some counterplay. And that's exactly what Capablanca still tries to avoid. And instead of committing to opening files on the queen side, he chooses a simpler option, pawn g4. He expands on the king side, where everything is totally safe. Black does not have any pieces there, really, and white is keeping everything under control, therefore black can't go forward anywhere, and therefore g4 is just totally safe. Now black goes bishop d7, now rook c2. White is getting ready to reroute the rook to the king side. King h8, black is careful, and prophylactically get the king out of this file. Rook g2, maybe white is hoping to open up the g file. Black goes rook g8, and now that's another important moment. How would you play here? It's natural as you started expanding on the king side to think, how do I go forward there? How do I make threats? How do I checkmate the king? But Capablanca thinks differently. He first of all asks himself, what does my opponent want? What's the idea of this move? Okay, maybe he's just defending, consolidating pieces on the king side, but it could also be that black actually wants to play g5 himself, right? He's got quite many pieces controlling this square, and g5 would make things much more chaotic, and that's why Capablanca locks it with g5. By the way, I understand you may be thinking, Igor, it's all clear when I see games of grandmasters, but when I'm playing myself, it's totally unclear what to do. I got it, and that's why also I developed a free masterclass where I show you the exact thinking process strong players use, and if you're curious, I'll link it down below. Now back to the game. Black played queen d8, and now white plays h4. White now keeps expanding on the king side. Now he hopes to open up the h-file potentially. King to g7. Black is still careful. h5. White is getting ready to occupy the h-file. Black puts the rook right there, potentially getting ready to recapture with his pawn so that his rook will have activity there. Rook h2. White is putting the rook there. Queen c3. White starts rerouting his pieces to bring also the other rook to the h-file and to increase the pressure. And black goes rook g8. Black is again super extremely careful there, consolidating everything on the king side, getting ready for white to open up the h-file, and black is fully prepared. By the way, the black player was a master level player. He once defeated the world champion Alekhine, so he was not an easy opponent. It's just that Capablanca's play always makes it somehow look effortless for him. But in reality, he's got a tough opposition. Queen a1. Now, he's probably here kind of waiting for the right moment to make the ultimate committing decision, whether to open up the h-file or to push forward or to push here. At some point, while we'll need to make a decision, but for now, he's just waiting for the best opportunity to do so. Rook b8, black moves around, he doesn't have much to do, queen a3, rook b8, rook b to g8, and now finally Capablanca sees the opportunity to push the pawn forward. Now what's the idea? We'll see. After black recaptured, instead of taking here right away, he first played this in-between move h6, which makes a lot of sense. Now it pushes the king back to the f-file, and from there, the black king blocks his own rook, which now cannot be rerouted back to the queen side because of that king. But on top of that, there is also the second problem that black experiences. He now cannot take this pawn on b5 because of this petite combination, pawn to c6. It's a discovered check and also an attack of this bishop on d7, and black can't get here because he would lose a bishop. Capablanca was known, by the way, for these little combinations. He didn't like long, complex variations, but those 1-2 move combinations, he used them gladly. Now here, it means that black cannot take this pawn and he's got to do something else. By the way, the level of precision demonstrated by Capablanca is insane. In fact, Stockfish sometimes ask Capablanca to review its games for accuracy. But here, black goes king e7, he wants to open up this 8th rank for his rooks to move to the queen side. But now b6, kicking the queen back, and after queen b8, again those rooks are blocked and can't be easily rerouted to the queen side. White, however, can do that easily, rook a1. That's the beauty of space advantage. It's easy for white to move pieces left or right because he's got so much space to do so. Rook c8, black is still regrouping, queen b4, and after that white goes inside with rook to a7. Now, a nice thing about an open file is that it's easy to invade his opponent's position, and now, as we colloquially say, this rook is really a pain in the a file. Black goes king f8, getting the king potentially out of this opposition, and rook h1. Now white also moves the other rook to the open file, having a complete control here, king g8, rook a4. Now Capablanca uses the so-called Alekhine gun, putting queen behind rooks along the open file. Now there's just nothing black can do to potentially contest the a-file. Now black has nothing to do, he's just waiting, and at this point Capablanca played king g3. And what is the purpose of this move? Is it that just a doctor advised the king to have more fitness? Not really. When I thought about it, I realized how careful Capablanca really was. Because in this position, of course white is dominant, but nevertheless it's not easy to break through. The position is totally locked. And here, white already put his heavy pieces on this open file, there's not much we can do there. Potentially white would wish to use this knight for something more active. But if white tries rerouting the knight potentially to the queen side, for instance, black could take a chance and sacrifice the knight right here, and then suddenly the queen jumps out, starts creating threats, going after these pawns, and again things become more complicated. That explains why he moved his king to the king side, to prevent any slightest opportunity of his opponent to sacrifice his knight there and get some counterplay. Now we see that his low blunder rate is not an accident. He was just so attentive to his opponent's ideas. And he was actually undefeated for 8 years, just think about that. But of course, he had an unfair advantage. He couldn't play bullet at 2 a.m., right? Anyways, that's still impressive. Now, back to the game, we're maneuvering back and forth, then he decided to put the king to g2 to a more standard square, but still control all these squares so that in no future the queen can jump out there. Bishop e8, and now finally he decided to reroute the knight to the queen side, because another idea that Capablanca loved a lot is to attack opponent's pawns. Just think about it, they can't run away. They are the easiest targets. Try checkmating your opponent's king. That's much harder, even with such a dominance, but attacking a pawn, that's a piece of cake. And here, he moves this knight right here to a5, trying to take aim at the pawn. Black is still careful, he prepares a defense, and then does that. But now Capablanca uses another little combo, bishop a6, using the x-ray from the rook. Now we're doubling up on this pawn on b7, and black has nothing else to do but to accept the sacrifice. But now rook takes d7, hits this pawn on h7, but even more importantly, white managed to get this strong passed pawn and to disrupt black's pawn chain, so that all these pawns are now weak, and white has this excellent passed pawn on the b-file. Now black played rook e7, offering an exchange of white's active rook, and should you take on e7 or not? What do you think? Another Igor Nation rule, if you trade, be sure you're paid, meaning avoid exchanges for the sake of exchanges. trade if you can get something out of it. And here rook e7 would be wrong, because your rook is good, and that's just an exchange. Instead, Capablanca took on d8, using another little combo, and now after knight takes c6, white wins a pawn with this triple fork, and on the next move he would capture one of these rooks, and now white is totally winning. He's got 2 strong pass pawns, and he keeps attacking. Now, if you want to improve faster with a clear system, not just random tips, my free masterclass is linked below. And if you want to see Capablanca's most impressive checkmating attack, check this video out.